before all of my ramblings, turns out my unlabeled of mysterious origins copies of Rob Zombie's Halloween and Halloween 2 were both unrated director's cuts, not the theatrical versions. And since it's Rob Zombie, nothing really stuck out to me as excessively brutal or weird to tip me off. My review still stands, they're just based on those versions.
Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 is one of the strangest movies I have watched in a while, and I mean that both as a compliment and a warning label. I genuinely, at no point in time, had any idea where this movie was going. Which, in a franchise as old as Halloween, that's kind of refreshing. Usually by the second movie, you know the assignment. Michael escapes, Michael stalks people, Michael gets stabbed, shot, crushed, burned, or otherwise receives a temporary inconvenience before returning for the next sequel. Rob Zombie looked at that formula and said, what if Michael Myers needed a 2 hour therapy session, but everyone involved was too traumatized and covered in blood to actually attend? And somehow, that is not entirely inaccurate. After enjoying Zombie's first Halloween, I expected another brutal slasher, and instead, this is almost a psychological horror drama about trauma that occasionally remembers it's supposed to be a Halloween movie and goes, oh, right, somebody should probably get murdered now. The biggest surprise to me was how much attention it pays to the people left alive. Annie, Sheriff Brackett, and Lori aren't just survivors waiting around to become the next body count. They're people whose lives have been completely destroyed by what happened. Brad Dourif is fantastic as Sheriff Brackett. Dourif has this weird superpower where he can play some of the grimiest, strangest villains imaginable and then turn around and make you believe he is the most exhausted, loving dad you've ever met. He he doesn't make Brackett a superhero. He just is a guy trying to keep his daughter and this other traumatized young woman alive while everything is falling apart. And Danielle Harris as Annie is such an interesting casting choice. For longtime horror fans, there's an extra layer because, yes, she played Jamie Lloyd in the original Halloween continuity. So apparently, Rob Zombie looked at one of the franchise's most famous child survivors and said, congratulations, you're now the exhausted adult survivor trying to survive Michael Myers, which is very on brand for horror and Zombie himself. Laurie's storyline is probably the more interesting part of this movie. She's angry, unstable, and at times genuinely difficult to like, but it feels intentional. Zombie doesn't turn her into some badass final girl who walks away stronger than ever. He shows someone who survived something horrific and has no idea how to live afterwards. And then she finds out that the man who murdered her friends and family in front of her wasn't just some random monster, he was her brother. And suddenly, every terrible thing that happened to her feels connected. This is an absolutely brutal thing to put on a person. She isn't just dealing with surviving Michael Myers, she's dealing with the terrifying question of whether Michael is somehow part of her. Scout Taylor Compton really sells that unraveling. And Tyler Mane also continues to be one of my favorite Michael Myers performances. His Michael in this one feels completely different than the first movie. The first movie, Michael had purpose. He was focused. He was hunting. This Michael feels like he is falling apart. The man who spent years obsessed with finding his family has finally found Lori, and instead of getting what he wanted, he got rejected, shot in the face, and left wandering around the woods like the world's angriest missing persons. The visual deterioration is one of the strongest ideas in this movie. The mask is falling apart. His appearance is becoming more animalistic. He looks less like a person hiding behind a disguise and more like a legend that's starting to rot into the dirt. Also, I have to mention it, Tyler Mane having to duck through doorways will never stop being funny to me. This man is so large that every building has to briefly ask permission before allowing him inside. The violence is also much heavier than in the first film. Zombie takes Michael's rage and puts it directly into the filmmaking. The killers are the kills are uglier, more chaotic, and more brutal. But interestingly, by the end, when Michael is getting closer to Laurie, the violence becomes more restrained. Annie's death is mostly heard rather than shown, and the deputy's death happens in darkness when the sound is doing most of the work. It almost feels like Michael is becoming more focused as he closes in on his actual goal. Now, let's talk about Loomis, because wow, Malcolm McDowell is having a great time playing a man who has finally stopped pretending he isn't enjoying being famous. The thing is, I don't think Zombie invented Loomis becoming exploitative. I think he just removed the mask. Masks. The first movie already established that Loomis wrote a book about Michael. He already profited off of his patient. He already turned Michael into a story. The sequel just asks what happens when the man who built his career around the monster starts believing his own mythology. And the answer is he becomes extremely annoying at book signings. His claim that he became Michael's surrogate father is especially fascinating because did he? Michael stared blankly at this man for 15 years. Loomis might have been important to Michael, but Loomis is also clearly obsessed with making himself important to Michael. The difference between Loomis and Brackett is huge. One man talks about being responsible for a damaged child, the other man actually takes care of damaged people. When Brackett reads Loomis's book and immediately wants to protect Laurie from knowing the truth, that's the difference between someone who cares about a person and someone who cares about a narrative. Now, the parts where the movie loses me a little. The White Horse symbolism. I think I understand what Rob Zombie is going for, probably, but the movie has this very grimy, realistic, dirty visual style, and then suddenly Deborah Myers appears looking like she got lost on the way to a gothic perfume commercial. Everyone else looks like they haven't slept in days. Deborah looks like she has a personal lighting crew. The symbolism itself is interesting. The execution just feels like it's from a different movie. And I think that's kind of the problem with a lot of Zombie's artistic choices. He has real visual instincts, but sometimes he also has the artistic restraint of a teenager who just discovered black and white photography and heavy metal, which, to be clear, is sometimes why his movies are interesting. This guy swings. Sometimes he hits himself, but he swings. The biggest question I had by the end was how literal are we supposed to take Michael and Laurie's connection? The first movie spends so much time exploring nature versus nurture, and this movie starts leaning towards something closer to evil is in the blood. The idea that Laurie and Michael are psychically connected is interesting. The idea that the Myers family is somehow cursed gets a little less interesting. I think the strongest interpretation is that the visions aren't necessarily supernatural. Michael's vision of Deborah feels like the thoughts of someone whose mind is so fractured beyond repair. He's hearing his own desires and memories as another voice because he can no longer separate them from himself. And Laurie experiencing imagery works because she's been pulled into the same trauma. These aren't necessarily sharing a same ghost, but they're sharing the same wound. Also, can we talk about the therapist Lori has for a second? Lori says, I'm having terrifying, violent hallucinations. The therapist says, have you tried breathing? Ma'am. I respect breathing exercises. Breathing is fantastic. Everyone should breathe. But this girl is not having a rough Tuesday. She watched her friends die. She learned her entire identity was a lie. And she is now having disturbing visions of the people involved. Like maybe step two is slightly above inhale for 4 seconds. By the end, I don't know if I would call Halloween 2 a great Halloween movie, but I do think it's one of the more fascinating ones. It's messy, it's very overly long, it is absolutely convinced that every symbol needs to be walked onto screen wearing a name tag. But it is also deeply interested in something most slasher sequels ignore. What happens after the monster leaves? What happens to the people who have to wake up every day knowing what happened? Rob Zombie made a movie about trauma, identity, grief, and exploitation. He also made a movie where a 7-foot man eats a dog in the woods and a ghost horse is somehow part of the emotional climax. And somehow, both of these things are true. I still prefer Rob Zombie's first Halloween overall. I think it's tighter and a little more successful at what it's trying to say. But Halloween 2 is the one I'm still thinking about afterwards. I don't know if it's a masterpiece. I don't even know if it's completely successful. But I do know it's not boring. And in a franchise with 13 movies, that counts for something.